All right. Everyone can see my screen?
Yeah.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining at 2 p.m. on a Friday, recognizing this might be standing between everyone and start of some holidays and stuff like that. So hopefully you enjoy the session and learn some more about must support in AU Core. All right. Wanted to start that we acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we all gather today. We pay our respect to elders past, present, and emerging, and extend our respect to all Aboriginal and/or Torres Strait Islander people, acknowledging the First Peoples as the first scientists, educators, and healers. All right. Just as a quick introduction, my name is Andrew Aubrey. I am a incoming AU Core TDG co-chair. So for the next year, we'll be fulfilling that role. I am also an integration engineer at Epic, so a large EMR vendor, and I have been working with FHIR in a variety of different cases and locales in my day-to-day work. So today's goals is to really provide information about the concept of must support and how that relates to AU Core so that everyone participating in the TDG is better informed on the topic and what it implies for them. So this all kind of arose after I've been peppering Danielle with questions throughout the past year on these different things. And she recognized it was an important topic to me and gave me the opportunity to prepare this. The target audience for today is really implementers and developers that will be that are part of the TDG and will be developing, support, and implementing FHIR and AU Core for their systems. So we will be getting into deeper details if that is something that may get too technical for you, or you're not really interested in you can take this opportunity to drop off. Otherwise, we're going to focus on AU Core, the R4 version. We're going to walk through the definition of must support. We're going to talk through some related and supporting concepts that tie directly into that. We're going to then look at the usage of R4 and AU Core and look at some resources and examples of that. And then we'll talk a little bit about the actual implementation guide and the implications on an implementer and conformance to AU Core. Finally wrap up with some international considerations of what we've seen in IGs such as USCDI and how it relates to IPA and IPS. All right. So as you guys have all looked at the different profiles in the IG, you might have seen this red S appear a lot or a little on the elements table. Unfortunately, it is not red S for Santa, even though that is the holiday season. It is the red S to label elements as must support. So the definition of must support is part of the conformance section of the R4 base specification and does come into the conformance section of AU Core. This is how a participant, an implementer, a developer conforms to the specification and will inform any future conformance testing or certification that may be enacted, such as by the ADHA or other party. One of the key things is that labeling an element must support means that a participant shall provide support for that element in some meaningful way. What that meaningful way is is really up to us as the IG developers, the core TDG, to define. That is different that can be different for both responders and requesters, those two roles we will touch on shortly. And then finally, this is an excerpt from the obligation section, actually, of the R5 specification, but I thought it would be relevant to help provide additional context that just because something is labeled must support doesn't inherently define what that support is. So it is up to the implementers of that IG, the developers of that IG, to actually provide that meaning and context around that. And it's something that, as part of the AU core TDG, we really need to look at and understand. If we're going to label something must support, this is what it means to us, and this is why it's meaningful. As part of that, because the must support can apply differently for the different actors, we need to look at what an AU core requester is and what an AU core responder is. Those two roles are defined essentially as the client and server in any interaction. So the requester is the role that will perform queries or requests to the server. The server will then respond either to those queries with objects or accept objects that are resources that are passed to it. These roles also tie into the capability statements that are part of the requirements that must support ties into. Capability statements, while we won't dig into them too much today, they are essentially what provide the basic rules of what an actor must fill. So those actually say, as an AU core responder, as an AU core server, here are all the profiles, operations, search parameters, etc., that you are agreeing to. Now, when you actually do the must support on those profiles you agree to post or respond to, the must support elements then come in and say, these are the actual elements that are meaningful for support. One of the other topics that is related to must support, and you'll see in the implementation guides and profiles, is cardinality. So cardinality only defines the presence of the elements on a given resource. It does not actually provide any meaningful interpretation of that, so that it is solely the lower and upper bounds of how many times that element needs to be present in the containing model or element. This is just saying, for example, we have from the allergy and tolerance, we have these two elements have a cardinality of 1. Any resource that you are interacting with needs to have the code and patient element to be a valid FHIR resource, but it says nothing about what information those need to actually contain. The other elements that all have 0 cardinality are optional and can be excluded and just not present on the resource depending on the implementation. Must support is different because this adds additional requirements on when and how you should be populating that data, as opposed to the actual structure of the message. With that, we bring in the concept of missing or suppressed data and the requirements. There will be requirements we talk through on handling that, but must support is that intersection of, if an element has to be there and it has to be must support and it's marked as must support, we need to understand how to handle that with missing or suppressed data. So we need to show, for example, that if the code on allergy intolerance is required, but it is for a protected patient or it's a suppressed data element, you are now, in order to keep the resource valid, adding a suppressed data or data unknown element to that in order to keep the resource valid, but also attest to that must support. And it does bring up the question of, are there resources that conceptually can or should not exist without that missing data? Is an allergy intolerance resource truly valid logically if it has unknown for both code and patient, for example? The missing data element can use the data absent reason defined in the R4 code system. These elements give a bit more examples of, is it unknown? Was it not provided? Is it suppressed for different reasons? Is it not applicable in this context? But moving on to must support in AU core, we'll actually look at the requirements, going to look at the requirements by role. So what the actual requirements are on the requester and responder, how we've been labeling elements in AU core, and then talk through some examples of those must support elements. So taking an actual resource profile and comparing that with some JSON representation of that resource to understand the validity and how must support truly shows. The actual definition of must support is a requirement, and it's part of the, as I mentioned earlier, part of the conformance, a way that you attest to conformance for the implementation guide. So when you actually go and look, these are the requirements that come up. We're going to start with the responder or the server role for AU core. Must support hits on 3 key areas. Is the responder able or capable of populating an element? Is the responder populating those elements when available? And how is the responder handling missing or suppressed data? This is an excerpt of the actual requirement from the AU core IG. And we'll be going through all 3 of these in depth. So giving everyone a moment to read it, and then we'll look at these a bit more closely. Okay. So starting with the first shall statement, this says that a responder, as part of being conformant to AU core, shall be capable of populating all those elements as part of the query results defined in the capabilities statement. So as we touched on earlier, the capabilities statement says that an AU core server will be able to populate these, respond to these search parameters, these queries, and provide these resources. In AU core, right now, the only resource that is actually a shall capability statement is actually patient. So that would be the only one that you would 100% expect every conformant AU core responder to respond with. But when we actually look at the must support elements for a patient, that server, if they are returning that resource and that profile, needs to have the capability to populate every single one of those must support elements. So if some of those elements make sense, such as name or an identifier, and make sense in all contexts. Some elements might not make sense in all the different contexts, but if they are labeled must support, that server must be capable of populating them. For an element such as patient name, a server must be able to populate the name element, but the must support does not go down to lower levels of that name, human name resource or human name element to say these are the specific elements that must be supported in that data type, for example. This does have conformance implications because as an AU core responder, if you are conforming to the AU core responder role, you must now be able to demonstrate this capability, regardless of what that means for your workflows or your system. So when we go and look at some performance examples, you will need to be able to populate all those fields. The next requirement as part of the AU core responder is actually populating all those elements. So while we said the capability to populate all those elements must be present, this is the obligation to actually do so if and when the responder has data. So if the data is not missing or suppressed, a responder is required to populate. So we know from the previous requirement that they are capable of it because they conformed. They said we are capable of populating these elements. They've demonstrated that capability through conformance. Now, okay, there might be patient data that is suppressed for privacy or was not collected on that encounter. So it is not available. Everything else that's available, the responder has populated, but it now says these are the elements that we're not populating because they are not currently available, not because we're not capable, they are just not here. Finally, the third requirement comes in and says, now when those situations arise where you've been capable, you don't have that data available in this instance, here's what you should do instead. It gives us two scenarios. The first scenario being when a element is optional, so a cardinality of 0. If we do not have that data, if the AU core responder does not have that data, it just omits that element. That is still valid from the FHIR perspective because that element can be omitted, it is optional, and it adds no value saying it's absent. When an element is required, so it has a cardinality of at least 1 and must be included, AU core says that we should now utilize those missing data and data absent reasons in order to signify that this data is currently unknown, was not collected, or some other code. For certain elements, using the data absent reason is sufficient enough. For other coded elements, there might be a value in the code set that demonstrates unknown or some other relevant way to communicate that that data is not currently known for that patient. So taken together, these are the 3 requirements that drive the AU core responder role on the must support elements. To be conformant to AU core, a responder and server must show that they are capable of populating all those elements with meaningful data, must show that they will populate those when they have that data. And when they don't have that data, they will utilize the missing data element where appropriate. If we move to the requester side, so this is when a client actually makes a request to a server, I need this resource, or here is this resource as part of our exchange pattern, etc. These are the requirements for those requesters. There's only 2 and 1 may. So this focuses on how that data should be processed by the requester and what to do with missing or suppressed data. Processing is defined in AU core according to that text section at the bottom. Essentially, there are no hard requirements in AU Core for how a requester handles the data and what it means to receive a must support element. Does that mean they have to display it or persist it or store it to their database? It will depend on the element's value. So that is not actually part of the requirement of what you must do with it when you request it. And then finally, a requester also may choose to reject non-conformant resources. So if a responder replies with a resource that is not conformant, it is up to the requester to determine what they do with that. We will move into some examples shortly to look at some different scenarios and how that shows in the different JSON objects. But are there any questions at this point? Ruben.
Thanks, Andrew. And yeah, thanks for tackling this challenging topic. I guess my initial thought here is that by defining must support in terms of requester as client and responder as server, you're kind of making the implicit assumption that the adoption of AU Core is necessarily going to be in a client-server architecture. I was wondering what this then means for people that simply want to use it as a data model for creating other specifications.
That's a good point. And so what we've put there is the requirements around the two roles in particular, and what that means when you're enacting I guess a system role. But from an AU Core perspective, we're currently floating the idea that, like the US did, and I like the openness of this, that there are two ways to be conformant to AU Core. One is data only, profile only, where you're not therefore required to do these RESTful interactions. And the other is data plus your RESTful interactions. And these therefore are only the requirements around you occupying either a requester or a responder role. What does that mean if you're profile only? I'm not actually sure we're incredibly clear on that in the AU Core must support section, and we might need to really look at that and make sure that that's clear. From my perspective, at a really high level, it basically says my data is in this shape for whichever of those resources we have. It has the structure and the terminology and otherwise as defined by the profile. But I think we need to go through and make sure we're really, really clear about what that means. And I'm not sure we have. We've focused a lot on the system roles.
Yeah, I would welcome a sort of broader approach to this, and maybe consideration of a more general sort of role as being a FHIR data creator or FHIR data processor or something like that, which sort of makes it more broadly applicable.
I think that would be a third system actor to that, with you got your requester and responder behaviors, but then that third one for being and so Brett's posted there potentially in the chat of producer/consumer.
Yeah.
But we also need to understand that in most of the times in this defining the API, there's no requirement that someone is actually authoring necessarily the FHIR resources.
Yeah, that's right. And indeed, requesters, as part of their request, could be creating FHIR resources as well. So some of those requirements for responders may well apply to requesters as well.
At the moment as well, we've been quite careful not to be harder than what is in US core and IPA. And they're to date relatively silent on what the requirements would be around a producer of data. I think it would be interesting to continue to follow on that line of thought.
Yep.
And to that point, I did structure the entire presentation on the current state. So ideas for what we can change or need to address, I think, especially with the actors and the capability statements, is something that, you know, we've talked about a bit outside of just this. Stephen.
Yeah, I'm not sure what Ruben means by data modeling, but from what I understand and the purpose of FHIR, let's not forget that is for supporting interoperable data exchange. And so therefore, from what I stand, from where I stand, the specifications of the responsibilities of the requester and the responders are adequate. We are not going to dictate how systems are going to deal with the data internally. So I don't think that there is a need for us to define they must support in terms of their internal system operations.
Let me respond to that. One of the stated aims of AU Core is that it becomes a base specification for the creation of other FHIR implementation guides, which can constrain or extend what's in AU Core. If those specifications are to support architectures which do not adopt a client-server or API approach, then it's going to be very difficult to then make sense of must support if the definitions are phrased in terms of requester and responder.
Can you, Ruben, add a GitHub issue to the AU Core GitHub issues? Because I don't want to lose what you've floated here.
Certainly.
And that will allow us to continue to track this and talk about it. I think that might be an R2 kind of consideration, but I would like to take that idea forward and see what the appetite is in the TDG to consider that.
Will do.
Thanks, Ruben. Heath?
I think we need to be a little bit careful that we don't deviate too much from the terms and I guess the mechanisms around capability statement. So the capability statement basically has 3 sections around it, around whether you are REST, messaging, or document. Currently, AU Core only has 2 capability statements. Both of them are for REST, a REST client and a REST server. So along the lines of what Ruben's, I think, is suggesting, are we talking about documents? Are we talking about messaging? And then Danielle's also talking about something that's a little bit more abstract, which is basically, I don't know, like this concept of data producer or whatever. But what is the capability statement for that role? Because FHIR does not actually support that. So I get where you're coming from, Ruben, and I also understand and I like the idea of the abstract concept of, you know, profile only, but yeah, I just want to raise my concern about deviating too far from the fundamental capability statement concepts, including the difference in name, because they call it client and server, not responder and requester, and I know there's been some contention about that.
Yeah, and I'll respond briefly to that one. So I mean, yes, the capability statements themselves are called client and server for exactly that reason, that they are in fact describing through the FHIR structures those things. We've started with calling them requester and responder, I think, because that, from the people I spoke to as we were building out this initial content, was the language that people were using, primarily, I suspect, because US Core uses that, because that was what IPA was using, because all the other FHIR IGs, the national and international ones, was calling their system roles requester and responder. And so unless it's particularly meaningful in Australia to use some really specific language to connect with our community, and I had no indications it was, that's why we'd sort of started with those terms.
My only other response to that is if we are using the term responder and requester, then the capability statements probably should be renamed along those lines as well.
Do you want to raise a GitHub issue?
Yep.
Awesome.
It's easy response, isn't it, Daniel, with that one?
Well, to a degree, yeah. I mean, we've got feedback that's coming through, and that's what we want to do is capture that, put it in the GitHub issues, and then we can go through and actually work through. Do we do
Well,
that?
I wonder even if should we even be publishing capability statements at a
Yes.
core level if we're being abstract about it?
I don't think we are. I think the purpose of AU Core, at least R1 for me, is setting out the rules so that people can go, here's what I can ask for, and here's what I get back. Without that, especially having that opportunity to define how do we have a shared understanding of what I do when I don't know that data, it's just not going to lead to interoperability. There's a reason we've got the capability statements, which are actually the requirements on systems, not just the data in any form. How do I search? How do I do any of these things? We can't put any requirements around searching without using capability statement, because that's the FHIR tool for putting search constraints. So I don't think we should at all avoid it.
Thank you guys. And I think that the capability statement stuff and those pieces will obviously be things we talk about in the TDG moving forward too. Back to some of the must support stuff. Currently, there are elements labeled must support in AU Core. There are a lot of elements labeled must support in AU Core. If you go and look at any of the resources or profiles today, you'll see those red S's all over the place. This is part of the reason we're talking about this is because AU Core is still under development. The labeling of these elements can be added, removed, or put at different levels. If it's more important to have must support on more specific data data types under an element, if it's important to say, you know what, this element doesn't make sense to have as must support, or these elements are really form the core concept and should be must support. We are here today learning about this so that we can apply this to our development of AU Core. The labels are just a visual indicator. We have to then kind of ascribe the meaning to our goals of achieving interoperability between our systems in Australia. So making sure that these are meaningful to our goals, and do they fit with that definition of the minimum required data set for interoperability in Australia. And then we do want to be considerate of this will serve as the core building block for other IGs, such as the e-requesting TDG, e-requesting IG, and the work that TDG is doing. So will we be able to build other IGs on top of this? So we're going to move into some actual examples of this. One of the important things when looking at the actual must support and looking at a given resource, it is important to say, is this resource itself valid from a FHIR perspective? So is this instantiation of this resource valid from a FHIR perspective? Is this resource valid against the AU Core profile? And it's important to think, would this singular resource be enough to demonstrate conformance against the implementation guide? So we're going to look at some actual JSON objects and look at what is there relative to the profile definition, what may be missing, is that resource valid, and how would we use that resource towards conformance attestation for something like allergy intolerance or any of the other resources and profiles we look at. I did mock all these up in Notepad using the examples from the IG. So if there's any actual content issues or something doesn't make sense or there's a typo, apologies for that. But that's where I did get this information. So this is an allergy intolerance resource. It has a lot of the elements that we would expect to see. And when we take a first look at it, we kind of ask the question, is it valid from a FHIR perspective? Is this a well-formed FHIR allergy intolerance resource. Yes, it meets the cardinality requirements of the allergy intolerance resource on the right. So our allergy intolerance has a cardinality of 1 for the code and 1 for the patient. We have a code and patient element on this resource. And outside of that, there are no other requirements enforced other than things such as the actual types of the elements, which those should also be valid. The next kind of layer to this, is this valid against the AU core profile? Again, the answer is yes. It has the elements that this resource was able to populate. It has populated. So for example, we have must support on clinical status and verification status. This example, the clinical status and verification status have been populated. The type has not been populated, is not available in this resource, but it is optional. So in this case, when there is not a value for that optional element, the rules of must, or the requirements of must support in AU core says to omit that, but is not present. And then finally, our 2 required elements are also there. Now, would this resource alone be enough to demonstrate conformance to the allergy intolerance in the AU core implementation guide? It would not be, because this only shows the positive cases that you have been able to populate required elements. It does not show the cases that you have been capable, or the responder has been capable to populate all the must support elements. So this resource in and of itself does not demonstrate the capability to populate the type element of the allergy intolerance. This resource does not demonstrate the capability of the responder to populate the reaction or the recorder. Additionally, it does not demonstrate the capability to add missing data elements to the required elements of patient and code. So while it is a well-formed resource according to AU core and according to FHIR, it is not in and of itself enough to demonstrate conformance to AU core. Now, if we move to another example, this is a example of an allergy intolerance with only, besides the control elements of the type and ID, it only has 2 elements of code and patient. If you look closely, the code and the patient are both using the missing data implementation. So these are saying, for this allergy intolerance, the coded SNOMED value is unknown. And for the patient, the extension in that patient has a data absent recent of unknown. Again, from a FHIR perspective, this is it meets the cardinality requirements of the object. And from an AU core perspective, it meets the requirements of the must support. It says these were the 2 required elements. We did not have them, or the server did not have them for whatever reason. It has filled in the unknown flags for both of those. When doing something such as conformance and demonstrating conformance, part of that conformance testing will be showing that for required elements that you do not have the values for, the server can reply with the values unknown. Now, some of you might be looking and say, why would you have an allergy resource where both of those are unknown? That's a great question. It does really raise the question, is this meaningful at all if the 2 required elements are missing? Should those truly be valid to use data absent reason, or should that just not be a resource? So that is something to keep in mind. Go ahead, Heath.
So I'm interested that the code is unknown. But without being an exhaustive search in the binding for code for allergy intolerance, I would not expect unknown to be in that binding. So the validators would actually say that's invalid. Should we be putting an extension there on coding instead of, or on code
So
instead of
if
using the unknown?
part of the requirements around doing unknown is if the bound value set has a defined way to say unknown, use it. I don't know if that code is in it.
Well, there's an
Andrew,
explicit one that basically says something like allergy unknown or no known allergies or something like that. So
Fair. To be fair, I
okay,
just
well,
did a
if
quick
it's
search
just
on
your
that to
example,
say
then that's fine. I'll
that's
put my
purely an
hand down.
example that
Yeah,
this is
okay.
not a perfectly valid one. So
Yeah.
I'll keep
But-
that in mind for the next
But I think
example.
it's still a good example though. Like allergy aside, you know, we're going to have other cases like that. So
And
what you're
that's
saying,
really-
Danielle, is if there's a value, use it. If there's not, then an extension.
yes, basically.
Right. Okay.
That's exactly. So trying to just use an example of the coded unknown combined with the extension of data absent. So this example would be a much fuller allergy intolerance. But if we look closely, there is some missing elements, specifically the code element of what the coded value of the allergy is missing. From a FHIR perspective, this would not be a valid element at all, regardless of the must support, regardless of the AU core, because it does not have that code element that is required. So there is just a base level of certain elements need to be present and mandatory. If the resource object does not have that, they are not valid from the FHIR perspective. So not only at the base level, you have to meet valid FHIR resource, valid core resource, and then hit your must support requirements. Taking this all together, when actually going to demonstrate conformance to a resource, what this means is that every must support element will need to be demonstrated according to how it should be handled. For elements that are mandatory, conformance will require building and demonstrating cases where those elements have missing data and showing that the responder is able to fill those in with those data absent reasons or fill those in with the appropriate binding code to say that that data is not present. For the elements marked with must support and optional, examples and conformance cases will need to be generated and performed where every single one of those elements are populated. So while the server might publish their capability statement and say this server is conformant to this and can do those different things, when it comes time to do any type of conformance testing or certification that may be required in the future by AU core, by servers that are saying they are conformant to AU core, they will need to be able to populate all of these things by the current definition. And they will be able to need to do the different permutations of showing certain elements as optional, showing certain elements as meeting the missing data requirements, showing certain elements as meeting the suppressed requirements. And that's kind of why I highlighted at the top that we have multiple different objects or files to demonstrate this. Danielle.
Thank you. I just wanted to highlight for people that you're absolutely right, and it's by resource. So not every system is going to deal with every single resource. But for the resource you are using and declaring conformance to, then yes, this applies. So I just wanted to put that difference there. So I guess, for example, we were saying pathology labs. We don't expect them to have to deal with every single thing that we have in AU Core. They have a specific use case. There's sets of resources that make sense for them. Same with prescribing systems, same with other kinds of things. You're a bit up, a bit of a creek for, an EMR system, which is quite broad. But for the narrower systems, yes, at the element level, that and where the data type level is where these things will start to really come in. But it is resource by resource.
Thank you. That's a very good call out. Again, every single must support will need to be demonstrated in some way, shape, or form as part of conformance. Whether that conformance is just a statement, or if that's future conformance and certification testing, for example, the burden could be greater depending on how many flags there are. Moving into another example, using an AU Core requester paradigm for condition. So if, for example, a requester is building an app that's dealing with problem lists,
Say that again, 81.
they will look at the core condition resource and say, you know what, this would be an excellent thing that I would query a server for. Based on this definition, what can a requester expect from a conformance server? Does that mean they should expect to get everything labeled must support, or should they only expect to get elements that are mandatory? Which elements are they guaranteed to at least get something for? And then which elements should they expect to get if a server has it? And then finally, based on that, when they do perform that request, what are they obligated to do with that response as a requester? So for example, this is a full condition. So this has nearly all the data elements that are marked as must support in the profile. So the requester would say, great, I have so much to work with here. I have the clinical status, I have the codes, I have the recorder. They are super happy. They got everything they could possibly want and are going to do everything they need with that. Now, on the responder side, the same kind of question applies. When they are providing those resources for a core condition to a requester for that, this is the list of items that they must be capable of populating. It is not necessarily the list of that they're guaranteed to have every single time. It is the list of elements that they are required to populate via that cardinality and what they could expect to have at the minimum. But they are again, the responders kind of looking at what is the data that they need to support? What does it mean to them as a server to support that? What data do they have, and what data will they be sending if they have it? So for example, they might look at an individual condition and say, this is the data that we have for this condition. Based on the must support definitions and the requirement definitions, this is a valid FHIR resource. It's not as rich because it might not, as the previous requester example, but it has everything that they are obligated to support for this. So it has the code, it has the patient reference, it has some information about what type it is in category, but that could be, for example, all that responder actually collects or has on that patient. Now, they should, based on the definition of must support, still have the capability to have collected a lot of those other all those other elements and had the capability to populate those elements that are marked as must support. But the kind of idea here being just because everything is must support from a requester perspective does not mean you will always get all that data all the time. And then finally, this is an example of what would be an invalid condition. So if for some reason the requester said, please read this resource, and the server said, here you go, here's this condition. Notice it does not, again, have a coded element. It does not have a code, which is a required element by the FHIR. It's not a valid FHIR resource. So first of all, the server should not be doing this. It shouldn't send it. But now under the requirements of must support, the requester can just reject it, say this isn't a valid resource. I don't have to use it. I'm under no obligation to do anything with this. I did want to move a little into scenarios where the requester is actually, the client is actually pushing data to the server. So for example, as a requester, and I wrote that wrong. So as a requester, they need to create a new resource on a server. We're going to use an immunization example. This is only an example. The capability and statements in AU Core do not have any create obligations. So just as a, again, toy example for the purposes of understanding must support, this is not a scenario that you may see immediately in AU Core, but could be a scenario that arises in future IGs, such as the e-requesting IG. So the requester says they're going to be creating an immunization object, and now they need to push that or create that resource on a AU Core server, AU Core responder, to say they need to share that information and push that out to them. They'll look at the immunization object and say, okay, what are the required elements? What are the elements I'm expected to populate? So they may make they may make a resource that, again, has the required elements and is valid from a FHIR perspective, is valid against the AU Core, but would not be enough to fully show that they are capable on all those must supports. They might not, in these clinical scenarios, collect that data or use that data. So they'll omit those optional elements because they are not part of it, including only the ones they have. This requester example would not be enough to demonstrate their full conformance to this resource, but it would be enough for that context to share that resource to the server. And then on the responder side, when receiving a resource and to create that object, what are their obligations on the must support? So making sure that if they receive any of those elements, they handle those in a meaningful way. I am sure a server that is dealing with receiving immunizations or allowing immunization creates would want to receive as rich of an object as they can, because those are all the elements that are marked as must support, and they should expect and be able to handle receiving the vaccine serial number, receiving the entire protocol for the vaccine, and all those elements that may be populated, regardless of whether or not they're required. At this point in time, are there any questions about some of those examples? Okay, moving on. Now that we kind of talked about what that must support looks like for individual resources and looked at individual resources and said, Is this resource valid from a FHIR perspective? Is it valid from an AU core perspective? And would this resource be enough to demonstrate conformance as an actor in AU core? What does that mean for those actors implementing resources? Again, you need to kind of ask those questions of, will I be able to show that I am capable of populating all those elements? Will I be capable of creating a valid resource from the AU core? Will I be capable of demonstrating all those conformance requirements? Being able to populate the elements, having that capability, populating all those elements when you have all that data, and implementing the missing data requirements when you don't have that data, and then demonstrating all of those. So as an implementer of AU core, do you understand what you have agreed to implement based on these requirements? Do you understand how you will be able to demonstrate conformance for all those elements that are marked as must support? And how will you demonstrate the capability to populate those elements, especially for data your system does not use? So if, for example, on allergy intolerance, the category is not something that your system uses, but as a responder, you are still obligated to prove capability to populate that element. When doing conformance and demonstrating that, the more things that you have to demonstrate as must support does drive the complexity of that conformance. So if there is a formal conformance testing or process, either regulated or part of a broader program, every must support will add additional time, complexity, and cost. So going back to the bigger picture, must support, it's a core concept that is driving conformance and how different actors conform to the implementation guide. It's going to be what our community in HL7 Australia uses to achieve our goal of strengthening the interoperability for patients here. And really, it's going to be important to find that sweet spot of balancing what is too much must support versus what is too little. What are the elements that provide meaningful context for interoperability in Australia? And separating that from what are elements that are just nice to have or not necessary. Identifying what are elements that become very important in order to share that context versus what are elements that can be looked at in future IGs or different scenarios specifically. What are elements that may apply to some scenarios but will not apply to all broader scenarios, and how do we handle some of the must support there? And then finally, should these things be at an element level that you have shown meaningful data to the overall element, or do these must supports need to be at a lower level? Do they need to be on individual data types under a given element? So there will be a lot of balance as we move forward with our development of AU Core in R1 in future releases. Internationally, US CDI has nearly an identical definition of must support. There were some implications from this definition. So in the US, the ONC did require certification for actors using US 4 on FHIR. And part of that certification said, you must meet the conformance requirements of these. You must meet the conformance, and that conformance is driven by must support. So you must show capability to populate these elements, even if those have no useful meaning in your context. If you are doing that profile, while you might not use that concept or that piece of data, you need to still show that you are capable of populating that, which led to vendors needing development or adding things that may not have much meaning in their context. So that is important that we make sure we get our must support definition to be tailored to what we want. So if there is future certification for Australia, we're able to achieve that and in a meaningful way. The other portion is looking at IPA and IPS. Those are something that is important for AE Core to play nicely with. It is an international minimum. So theoretically should have even less must support than us and should be the bare minimum of what's needed to do patient access or patient summary exchanges. And we should make sure that we don't conflict our supported elements with those IGs. So making sure that any conformance to AE Core does not preclude IPA or IPS conformance due to must support. Kind of looking into the future, in R5, there is a section titled obligation and the obligation extension. And what R5 does is adds a bit more context on the concept of must support and implementation obligations. This allows implementation guide writers to more structurally define the obligations between actors of that are defining the implementation guide. So it has better support to say, you know what, this is a must support for a responder, but this may not be a must support for a requester or vice versa. So as we look at the elements that we have marked as must support in AU Core, we can use some of this thinking to either fold that in as a narrative and say, these are the elements that are important for servers to handle in these meaningful ways. These are the elements that a requester should handle in these meaningful ways. Or we can look at bringing that in a more structured manner, structured manner. But it does provide a useful lens on how to some things we should think about as we evaluate all of our elements for must support. So going forward, really what we want to make sure is that we don't get to R1, get to that full release without all the participants knowing and understanding your obligations for must support and what that means for you in conformance. So when this goes to different releases, you understand what you have signed up for being conformant to AU Core and getting the best outcomes for the cost. So as a TDG member, you should really be evaluating, what do these must support obligations mean to you? What do they mean to your system? What do they mean to your implementation? As it currently sits, based on the elements that are labeled as must support, what is the overhead for your development, your conformance, and your conformance testing? Are these elements that are labeled must support correct? Are these elements that you agree should be must support, or do you think these are elements that should not be must support? Are these elements that you think are absolutely crucial to being must support? Are these elements that you think, you know what, you can understand why it might be one very small core case, but overall the element itself should not be marked as must support? So really looking at it from the AU Core IG and going through those elements and those profiles that you as an implementer will care about, and making sure that those must support tags and those must support labels are applied to elements that you agree with. If we want to hear, are these elements that you think should not have must support on it? We want to hear, hey, this element actually should have must support on it. Here's why. These elements should have must support removed. They're not applicable in these cases. They don't add value. These are all feedback points that we would love for you guys to raise on the AU Core GitHub. So moving forward, as you guys, as implementers, and as you go through this implementation guide and evaluate it with your implementer hat on, ask questions. Bring these questions to Zulip. We'll have a Zulip chat specifically for questions regarding must support. Do you need advice of, given this scenario, should this, like, what are my obligations under must support for this element? Given this context, what do I need to know? If there's explicit feedback or proposals on things that should have must support removed or must support added, please bring those to the AU Core GitHub, raise them as issues there, and we will work through that feedback. Based on all these questions and the feedback that's generated on the AU Core GitHub and the Zulip, we'll work through that feedback over the coming 2.5 months to bring kind of an update to the March Connectathon, and to have either a proposal for refined must support obligations, or do we need to have a larger breakout session at the March Connectathon? That will all be driven based on the commentary that you as TDG members add to the Zulip and add to the GitHub.
I've just popped links in the chat. So I've popped a link to the AU Core GitHub where people can create stuff. I'm expecting Ruben and Heath to drop things in there, but out of today's thing. And I've also created a awesome Zulip stream, and I've popped that in the chat there. It's called AU Core Must Support, unsurprisingly.
Thank you very much, Danielle. And with that, is done with my presentation for today. If there are any questions, would be happy to address those now. Otherwise, I recognize it's after 3 o'clock on a Friday, and you are more than welcome to move to greener pastures. Ruben, go ahead.
Thanks, Andrew. I guess it's a general question to the group. When you've got a must support element, which is coding or codable concept, which has an extensible or required binding, does must support require support of all the values in the bound value sets?
Now, there are different requirements depending on whether you're a responder or a requester. Where the expectation, I guess, going from, so the same thing applies to me if I think about it that way, from a value set, having a potential set of options from which you can populate an element. If you're a server, it's kind of the same thing of having a series of elements from which you can populate, and having those 3 points that Andrew brought up around demonstrating that you could populate, but then that you're only populating from the values you have. And from the requester side, they have to be capable of processing resources with any of the values from that value set. Because they might get any of them according to AU Core. And they might also get, depending on the binding, something else. And they need to be capable of processing the resource meaningfully. We're not saying what that is in AU Core because it's at a high level, but they still need to be capable of processing the resource meaningfully if they get something, some other code, if it's from an extensible or preferred binding.
All right. I think we probably would be serving our stakeholders well to make that clear in the must support page.
Mm-hmm.
Just ask something from a data perspective, so neither as a requester or a responder, just for an organization that's putting together their data sets and their data structures at the moment. So we may be 6 to 12 months away from using servers and writing queries. What advice would you give to our organization in terms of how we interpret the must support in order to, I guess, future-proof when we get to that stage where we're exchanging data? Because I find it difficult reading through the IG sometimes because it is very much at that technical level. So we almost need to go back a step and say, okay, well, before we get to that stage where we're exchanging data, how do we make sure that we create the data sets and the data structures to future-proof for when we get to that stage? Because I find with a must support, it's difficult to figure out, like there isn't a blanket rule, presumably. So it's about what is required on this particular element, on this particular resource. And so do we just look to see whether there's a particular value in a value set already, like no known allergy, so we use that. So I guess, do we still read that the rules in the IG from a data perspective as if we're the requester?
If you're trying to, and I think what I'm taking this is you're trying to ensure that you can surface the data that's in your systems in conformant FHIR resources, basically. And that, from that perspective, you're probably acting more like a server. Where you're saying that you want to have available this data, and that your end pathway is to be able to respond to, like, people other systems trying to say, I want to see that data. So your roadmap sounds like a server, and you do need to read, well, there's a set of guidelines on must support of the things that are implicit or pointed to in other places, and they are the FHIR, in general, the FHIR conformance requirements, the FHIR standard in and of itself for the resources that are relevant to you. The AU core specification is putting requirements on top of all those things, so they're already implicit. And I guess from that perspective, everything that's in the FHIR standard is allowed unless we get more specific in AU core about it. And in some circumstances, we're putting in the preferred or extensible bindings. Extensible has some definite meaning for you. Preferred, and I think Brett did a good presentation on this. I think maybe it was last Friday, around how to read some of the terminology constraints and bindings in a FHIR IG and how to interpret them. But yeah, you do have to look at the data types and the profile requirements. Some of what we've got in the profile implementation guidance will help direct you. And I feel like I'm actually getting off track from what you asked. Which is yeah, sorry.
I guess just in terms of what advice from a non-technical perspective you can give to organizations that aren't at the point where they've got servers and they're just trying to build data sets, because it sounds like the must support is still a moving piece as well. So if we're implementing now, how mature is the must support for the AU core in terms of, is it likely to change with the process that you're going through at the moment with getting feedback from organizations and the wider public?
My opinion is, after Andrew's just made this crystal clear to us, that there'll be a lot less must support than what's currently there.
That's my hope as well.
Okay.
I agree. I think there's a couple of directions that I would like to see us clarify, and they are about reducing the obligation burdens of AU core implementers. They are about ensuring we've only got the must support flagged on the elements that we really mean to, rather than stuff that would be nice or isn't that quite interesting. And that we really, really need to look at data types. And I'm happy to explain that for about 5 minutes, which I'll do that, but I'll let Brett also maybe go first, and then I'll pose to the group why I think we very muchly need to look at setting must support inside some of the data types.
Yeah, I was actually kind of heading that way myself in terms of what the discussion would be. Yeah, I think as a responder, if you can supply a valid piece of data that meets the rules and is in that must support slot, you are meeting the criteria of being a valid responder. Doesn't mean you have to supply all the different, be able to even supply all the different values, as long as the values you can supply are valid. So I think that's, and this is also particularly like that, that's in terms of codable values, but also I think especially in data choices, if you have a choice of different elements, for example, condition onset has, various data types that can be supplied, like a date, time, and age, a period, and another one, I think. But the your system probably may not support all of those ideas. So I think it's fair to say, your system would supply the things that it does, and it doesn't necessarily imply that you need to do all of the mechanisms, unless we go down into the next level of the choices and start saying we must support particular choices, as well. So I think this is where we again need to sort of get into that detail, and I think that's a bit like what Danielle's talking about as well, in terms of getting down into, do we need to be more explicit, and or in some places, which kind of relaxes things maybe for possibilities. But as the issue will be that obviously if one system does support, say, date, time for onset, and another system supports age only, unless both of those things are supported by the receiver of the data, there's going to be information that can't be consumed, right? So it does quite require some careful consideration, I think, in terms of where we put, how far we go, and how broad a requirement we're trying to state, because I think that's where sometimes it sounds easy to put must support on an element, but if we're saying you have to do a lot of different things downstream, it actually can be quite difficult to handle. Yep. Oh, you're on mute, Daniel.
I am, thank you. Mel, I think you should start with your internal data model and try and map your data model to AU core resources and profiles and get an understanding of where that scope is. That's where I would be starting.
Yeah, and I think the thing is, like, if we come to the point where you say this resource can't exist without these things, like we really mean it, then that's a kind of different thing. But yeah.
Let's look at something like address, contact point, human name. By setting it the element, we've not gone any further. That's where our agreement around interoperability stops. And therefore the expectation is we can somehow understand all of what that data type does. It's not so much that hard for codable concept. I think that's fair. We all get coding, we all get text. And that's an okay stopping point for me. But in things like human name, are you going to be able to meaningfully process all of these parts, including period? If we don't go inside the data types, that's where we're stopping. We're saying kind of all of this then. And I've seen other implementation guides, and I think we need to strongly look at this to say, no, the bits on where we have a consensus nationally for the minimum for sharing people names for patients and practitioners is actually only some of this, not all the parts of the data type. So that's something that I think we really need to think about around like names and addresses and contact point. And I mean, dosage. When we go into medications, the dosage and timing data types are huge. And I don't think that means that everyone actually expects to get all of that. So I think that's somewhere we need to go for AU Core, and I really hope we can get there in R1. Otherwise, I think what we'll find is we'll get all that feedback and have to put it into R2. I'll stop sharing it. So yeah, definitely think about data types. Do you actually do all of them? And maybe we should put up a form or something and talk about what's actually implemented in systems around like names and addresses and those things. And I'll bring it back to your other part of the question, Mel, that you posed about how much will the definition of must support change. I think overall we've got a relatively good consistent starting point, and I think it's now about making sure that we've constrained the data types where we need to, that we don't have elements with must support just because it would be great. And we need to refine I think the definition, and also taking from the comments that Ruben made on make it clear around what does must support mean when you're neither a requester or a responder, you just have data.
Yes, I think that would be great. Yeah.
Well, it seems like unless there's any
Any
other hands up, we
other
might be done.
questions? Yeah. Rachel, go ahead. Rachel, I don't think we can hear you if you are speaking. Looks like you are off mute, but hear you.
How about we go to Heath and then Rachel just jump in at any time.
Thanks, Andrew. As I said before, a really good presentation, and I think you've made it crystal clear on what we're up against, in particular from a conformance perspective. And I wonder if you've got any sort of first-hand experiences that you may have been involved in anything like this in the US or anywhere else that you can, I guess, on how we're going to go about it as a Spark team, more so than perhaps as vendors, but yeah, to be able to produce that library of test cases around testing every must support and missing data and things like that.
Yeah,
maybe we can take this offline if we don't have time, but
I think it'd be a great thing for the AU Core team to take offline of how do we get that test suite together. And I know that's something we've talked about from just a data perspective separately. And I think this will tie into that of making sure the data set or the example test data set we do try and publish for AU Core also supports the permutations of our must support elements. And I do think it is something that all implementers for AU Core should be looking at of what are the implications to them as implementers, as developers, to make sure that the current iteration of must support won't be too onerous or too heavy to achieve for them. The small anecdote I have and always gets shared with me by some of my colleagues back from the US is that when US CDI did go to certification to say the responders and the actors, you attest to conformance here, the ONC did come and say, this is the certification process. You need to demonstrate these things based on the capabilities that you are saying you're conformant to. I think it was care plan, goal, and associated date. For example, it was not something that we saw any of our customers use. A lot of people saw use, but was marked as must support. So it had to be shown that you're capable of populating it and having to do interactions based on that. And again, it didn't provide value, but it was never kind of caught in this process to say no one uses this or no one finds value in that. So making sure we all take that opportunity as implementers to say this is or is not important to us now. Yeah. Rachel, it looks like you're able to speak again.
Can I? Awesome.
Yes.
Sorry, and I just put my question in the chat too, but yeah, I realize we're kind of almost run out of time, but I'm interested in if someone wanted to create a profile based off AU Core and how the must support definition applies to that profile. Does the must support definition need to be inherited, so to speak? And how
Short
that might
answer
work?
is no, and we will. Yes, great point. I forgot to even talk. Not that we had time today, but yes, short answer is those must supports that we just talked through. Most of those are bound up in system actors, not necessarily the profile itself. So the profile calls out must support elements. So I'm going to give a real short answer, and we'll do a longer one later. And if you're going to use AU Core at the profile only level, that means you inherit the must support flags. You get to define what that means for your system actors.
Yeah.
But you can't take off must support elements. The behavior there that we've defined is still all bound up in the system actors, where you would say my system plays these roles, and that's where it applies those other things. So
Okay,
if your
yep.
system is going to actually declare that it is an AU core client plus this thing you've defined,
Something
then
else,
you
yeah.
also inherit the AU core
Sure.
client requirements.
Yep, makes sense. Great, thank
I
you.
don't think you would derive from AU core unless you valued the must supports that were mentioned there. Probably is an answer too, because it's you know, it kind of implies that you think your business has something to do with the AU core business, and might be the basis of how what you want to achieve. Yeah, so I kind of think if your case was way different than what AU core was saying, I'd say, you know, why are you driving from AU core? Yeah.
That being said, we do want to make a move in a HL7 space to have people have a variance process where you are expected to be conformant with, which may not be derived, but declare conformance with AU core, or to have a justifiable reason why you're not, basically, because yes, that aspect of your business is so different that we recognize that from the business case. But that's all work to do for us in a HL7 FHIR working group kind of space.
But I think too, it's really important for like this AU core work is sort of the first real test of must support use in Australia, you know, in a meaningful way, right? So it will have an effect on how we do business in general and how other people writing IGs will do business. So yeah, we kind of need to, as much as we can work out how to do this and do it well and get a good result, that's probably very good, valuable material for everyone.
All right. It is 3:30. Thank you all for joining today. If you have, again, if you have questions regarding must support, please definitely pop them in the Zulip. If you have explicit IG feedback or changes that you want to propose, drop them on GitHub and we'll take those under advisement. We will be looking over that all in the coming 2.5 months and hopefully be ready to provide an update at the March Connectathon. Otherwise, I hope everyone has a wonderful weekend and a wonderful holidays coming up. So thank you.
Thanks, Andrew.
That's good. Thank
Thanks,
you.
Andrew.
Very
Thanks.
much. Bye.
Bye.